All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Do any of you ever worry a little bit about what's going on in the world, just kind of world affairs and all the stuff you hear in the news? Anybody ever?
Every day. You listen to it.
He does.
You will be so glad that the Lord brought you to Bible study. You really will. This is just like last week, a very exciting lesson, I think, with a powerful message. So just to kind of introduce here, we talked last week about the three different exiles into Babylon once Babylon finally conquered Judah. And you remember the name of the Babylonian king, that was Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar was one of the stars of last week's lessons, because he was the one that threw the three men in the fiery furnace. That was chapter 3. And the next chapter, chapter 4, we're not doing that as part of our Bible study, but it is going to come up in today's lesson. So you do want to have at least some familiarity with it, I hope. And you may recall that it was part of the readings not that many weeks ago. It was the Old Testament lesson for Sunday morning. But that was the story about Nebuchadnezzar, where he's walking out on the balcony, and he looks how great his city is and his empire, and he's talking about how great he is. And remember, God struck him with madness, and he believed that he was a cow, and he went out and ran naked in the outdoors for however long, until his reason returned to him, and he realized that no matter how great you are, how much glory you have, God gives that to you, and God can just as easily take it away. And he learned that lesson. Well, today, now the next chapter, we see that exact same lesson happening, but not with Nebuchadnezzar, with somebody else. But before we actually read it then and start getting into it, I want to just show you this short video. So we're not going to tape it. Are we off?
No, I'm going to cut
waiting.
it out.
Okay, good.
I'll
cut
just
it out.
cut it out, yeah.
All right, good, because I don't have permission. So we're just looking at something on YouTube, right? So you can go home and look at it on YouTube, but it's not going to be part of our taping or our presentation, because I didn't get permission beforehand. And there's several things like this, and it's kind of a computer animated tour going through the city of Babylon. So it's based on descriptions of things and archaeology, what we know. So it's probably pretty true to life, I think, for the most part. And it's also short enough. It's less than 3 minutes, so it doesn't take up our whole Bible study time. But I think it's very good. And I want you to look for some things. So Babylon itself, during this time, had a huge wall, 40 feet high, that went all the way around. About, I saw one place said 200 miles. That's hard for me to believe.
Wow.
But I don't know. But 40 feet high, and it was wide enough that you could ride a chariot on top of the wall and just circle around the whole city on the wall. 250 towers going all the way around. And some of the places, like you'll notice, for example, one of the main gates is the Ishtar Gate, and that was painted, the walls and everything was made out of brick. It's totally flat there in Babylon. There's no rocks. It is flat as a pancake, so everything's made out of mud bricks. But they would paint them blue, and then they would embed these images of cows and lions and all kinds of stuff in them to make them really elaborate. And I actually remember part of the Ishtar Gate was reconstructed. Oh no, did this go away on me? Was reconstructed at a museum in Berlin. So when I was there, when I was 10 years old, I saw it. And part of the old bricks are like all crummy, and then they made new bricks to kind of fill in, so you could have part of that wall. So I want you to look for that. You'll also notice,
There it is.
there it is, oh, okay. You'll also notice a great big huge ziggurat, something that looks kind of like a pyramid. They had several, but their biggest one was dedicated to their main god, Marduk. You'll also notice in there the hanging gardens of Babylon. So you maybe have heard of that. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A huge building with terraces and tiers going upward and then planted with all beautiful plants, elaborately decorated. And they had, we don't know for sure how they did it, but probably like Archimedes screws getting water up there so that there were waterfalls coming down from the top of this building. And the Euphrates River goes right through the middle of the city. Look for some of these things as you're observing this. And I want to just give you a sense of how beautiful this was. Backhoes or crawlers or tractors. They built that city.
Amazing.
Yes. You can see why Nebuchadnezzar might have felt a little pride, right?
Yeah.
Well, looking at all of this, look at how great my empire is. Huh? So with that background, let's look at chapter 5 now, Daniel chapter 5. And I'll invite you to just follow along as I read it. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple, and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain the riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, so let's just work through that and try to put some things together to see what was going on there. So Nebuchadnezzar, the one who conquered Judah, he had died in 562 BC. So he had a son, Elul-Merodach, who then became king for 2 years. And then he was murdered by his brother-in-law, the guy that had married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So that guy, Neriglissar, reigned for 4 years, and then he died. And so his son became the king, but he only lived for a few months, and then there was a plot against him, and he was murdered. And so the guy, one of the guys that was part of the plot to murder him, they made him king. So his name was Nabonidus, and he became king in 556. Now it's very interesting because they've known about Nabonidus, but there was, for a long time, there was no evidence that there was any king named Belshazzar. So the liberals used to think that this book was just invented. Someone just made this story up. And then in the middle of the 19th century, they started to find this evidence and discover, yeah, there really was a guy named Belshazzar. So Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. And Nabonidus, at one point during his reign, went from here in Babylon down here somewhere to a city in Arabia, and he lived there for 10 years. And so his son Belshazzar became co-regent. So Belshazzar is really, he's running the show. So he is like the king. Well, what was happening was the forces of Media and Persia started to grow more and more powerful. They had already come over this way and conquered Lydia, and then they started moving this way against Babylon. And so Nabonidus came back, and he was leading one of the armies of Babylon, and he lost. And so Belshazzar is in the city of Babylon, and it was in 539 that Persia conquers it. I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit, because we know the actual day. We know a lot of the details. Very interesting. So as we go through this, what we're seeing then is just like with Nebuchadnezzar, who was so proud that God gave him this madness, this boanthropy, and he became like a cow until he learned that God is the one that gives all those good things. Belshazzar too is filled with pride, and Belshazzar is an affront to God by what he does, and so he also suffers God's judgment. So you see why these chapters come one after the other? They're both touching on that theme. So Belshazzar gets the vessels of gold that had been taken from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar, and they're toasting. He's having this big banquet, 1,000 lords, and all his wives and all his concubines, and they're having this, you can just imagine what kind of party this is, right? And they're drinking, and they're toasting all the gods of these other false gods. One interesting part of history, when the Persians started coming toward Babylon, Nabonidus had the main statues of gods in some of the surrounding cities of Babylon, had those statues brought to Babylon for safekeeping, so that if the Persians conquered those cities, they wouldn't lose those important statues. So now here we find Belshazzar in the capital toasting all these false gods. They're probably right there, aren't they? It's probably a kind of a big deal. It's like a special museum exhibit going on. They're all excited about it. And what we're seeing here is how nations and kingdoms rise and fall, but who's behind it? God is. And that's a theme throughout Daniel. You see God in the book of Daniel planning already ahead what's going to come, and with the nations that are going to arise, and the empires that are going to rise, and which ones will succeed which ones, but it's all part of God's big plan to
Tim, shut it off. I don't know what that is. Shut it off. I don't know what that is, but it's going to be distracting.
Oh,
Commercials.
for goodness sakes.
We've never seen that. I have no idea.
I have something else to show later if we
But,
have.
yeah. Well, that's not moving that or anything.
Yeah.
It's going to drive me nuts.
All right, so a few things that we want to note here. Daniel chapter 2 is another one we did not go through. But if you go through it on your own later, you see that's where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And the dream really troubles him. And so he tells all of his magicians and enchanters, come and tell me what the dream means. And they have to tell him what the dream was. He says, if I tell you, you'll make something up. So in the end, Daniel is the one that tells him the dream. And what it was a giant statue. So you maybe remember this. The head was made of gold, the chest of silver, the torso of bronze, and then the legs of iron, and then the feet iron mixed with clay. And each of those is a great empire. So the gold is the empire of Babylon. The silver is the empire of Persia, which is going to take over Babylon. The bronze is the empire of Alexander the Great, which is going to take over Persia. The iron is going to be the Roman Empire. And then the iron and clay is going to be the Roman Empire at the end when it started to disintegrate. And the important thing to note there in that whole chapter is that Daniel says it's at that time that God is going to establish a kingdom that will last forever. Well, what's the kingdom that was established at the time that Rome was starting already to break down?
Christianity.
The kingdom of
heaven.
right, the kingdom of Christ.
Yeah, Christ.
Right. So all the things going on with all the emperors and all the armies and the movements of people and everything happening in the whole world, what's behind it all? God's purposes for the kingdom of Christ. Amazing stuff. All right, so in chapter 5 here, Daniel, where I read, there are multiple times where Nebuchadnezzar is called Belshazzar's father. Well, as you heard me in the beginning, Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus. So there's a couple possibilities. It could mean that it's his father in the sense that it's his predecessor as a king in Babylon, or one ancient historian, Herodotus, notes that Nabonidus was also married to a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar could be the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And from what I understand from the commentators, there's no Aramaic word for grandson. You would say it's the son of, just like you would say the son of the father. So Daniel's point there is that Belshazzar should have known about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He should have known what happens when you get too proud and powerful. And he didn't. What did he do instead? He was throwing this in God's face with all his guests there. How's he going to impress them? Oh, let's go get the real cool gold goblets and stuff that came from the temple. That would be like, it would be bad enough if somebody had a party around here where they were toasting false things and false beliefs. But wouldn't it be like 100 times worse if they broke into the church and they were using our communion cups to do that, right? So you see kind of what's going on here? So it's a big banquet. Look at verse 2. The vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar's father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, he brought that the king and the Lord, his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And then notice in verse 3, he almost repeats the same thing again, doesn't he? Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple of the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. We learned that last week. When something gets kind of repeated like that in the story, what's the effect? It has a way of just showing that this idolatry that they participated in, that it was mindless, that they just robotically did this stuff. They're just caught up in it. Verse 4, there's obvious satire there, right? They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And we all know those things are not gods. Now, to be honest, the ancients knew those were not gods too. They didn't think that their god was actually the statue. The statue kind of was but the point in the scriptures, every time it criticizes the worship of idols, is that you should be able to see that just like this statue is nothing more than gold or stone or wood or whatever it is, so your God is nothing either. That's kind of the point of it. So then in verse 5, while they're having this big banquet, all of a sudden the fingers of a human hand show up. So all of a sudden Belshazzar looks and there's this hand writing on the wall. Now this has got to be the eeriest thing in all the Bible, right? Does this not give you the creeps? All this hand shows up and is writing on the wall. That is really something. But as the story's told, the focus is not on the kind of the creepiness of the hand being there. The focus is on what it does to the king. Right. Look at verse 6. The king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Right. And some of that is going to be repeated later on again too, to drive it home, that the focus is on the reaction that Belshazzar is having from this thing. And so he screams for his wise men, and he says, whichever person can explain the writing and interpret it is going to get a purple cloak. Purple's the sign of royalty, and they're going to be the third ruler in the kingdom. Why would they be the third ruler in the kingdom?
Because he's first and his son would be second?
Right, because Nabonidus and Belshazzar are the two kings. So Belshazzar cannot make him second. That would be going over his father's head. So you can see how even though people said, oh, the book of Daniel's so fake and they made it up years afterward, all the details of the book of Daniel point to the fact that this was legitimate from that time, understanding the situation that existed. So there's a message here in this, that God has spoken through these hands writing on the wall, but you also have to have the right guidance and the right wisdom to be able to understand it, or it's closed. That's the same for us today too, right? We have the Bible, but how many people the Bible makes no sense to them? They can't understand it, they can't grasp it, because what do you have to have? We need the guidance of the Holy Spirit to understand His Word. So that's always been true. So then in verse 10, talks about the queen. This is probably the queen mother. So this is probably not his wife, the queen. This would be the wife of Nabonidus, the father. And so she reminds him that in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, there was this fellow who was wise. He had did you catch that? It's interesting, in verse 11. In whom is the spirit of the holy gods? So in her worldview, there's lots of gods. But she recognizes that this fellow Daniel had the spirit. Yes, there's something to him. And he can interpret dreams, he can solve problems. And she tells him to call Daniel, and Daniel's gonna explain. So let him know God has this spokesman who has the Holy Spirit and is able to interpret. So verse 13, then they go find Daniel, and he's brought before the king. Now remember, Daniel was taken captive in 1605, the first exile, and this is now 539. So if he was a young teenager when he was captured, he would be 80 years old, probably. So he's not a young man anymore. And he was high in the ranks with Nebuchadnezzar. He proved to Nebuchadnezzar that he was wise. But now there's been several kings since Nebuchadnezzar, so he's been kind of pushed into retirement. Good thing that the queen remembered that he was there, right? So Daniel is brought in. Belshazzar lets him know, hey, I've heard all this good stuff about you, so if you can read the writing and make known its interpretation. You get to verse 17, and Daniel's answer is, let your gifts be for yourself or give them to someone else. In other words, he's not selling God's word, right? He's not doing this for profit. God's wisdom cannot be bought. But he goes on to explain, even before he interprets the message, he tells Belshazzar this story of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, and what happened. And it's because Belshazzar should have known this, that all your greatness, all your glory, all your majesty, that all comes from God. And you have personally insulted God by what you have done. You've gotten right in God's face. So Daniel is not afraid of what's going to happen here. You could say that this is the law. We're going to come to the gospel later in this chapter, but this is the law, right? That everything is pointing at Belshazzar and what he has done wrong. So verses 22 to 24, they've dishonored God by drinking from these sacred vessels, and they've been drinking in praise to these helpless gods who can't help them, can't do anything, instead of, and I kind of like that in verse 23, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honored. So they've honored all these false gods, but the God who could snap his fingers and Belshazzar would not be able to breathe anymore. That's the one that he's chosen to insult here. So then at 25 through 28 there, he goes through the writing on the wall. So the many tekel parson. Now, I have to admit, I did not follow all this very clearly. All those words in Aramaic, the astrologers and the other wise men, they should have known what those words were. And so there's a lot of theories as to why they couldn't read the words. But there's also something in there in the way that Daniel translates them, that the words all are plays on words. So they're all referring to something else, which together tells a story. I think it's too complicated for me to understand, so I think it would be too complicated to try to explain here. The bottom line is, though, this is the message. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You've been tried in the balances, weighed in the balances, and found wanting. That's a powerful image, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever remember the old scales we had on each side? So they put Belshazzar on one side of the scale, and whoop, he's got nothing, right? And then finally, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So what is this handwriting on the wall? Which is, by the way, where we get our English expression too. Have you ever heard somebody say, oh, then, yeah, the writing's on the wall. It comes from this story. It's a way of saying, this is already kind of doomed. This is not going to work.
Let's see the creepy hand now. I'll think of the
Now you'll think of the
hand.
creepy hand whenever someone says that, yeah. But because Daniel could explain the meanings of the words, and then also how they were word plays, Belshazzar clearly knew. He understood this. He wasn't just making it up. He did understand what these words were and how they fit together to create this particular message. So Belshazzar knows that he's right. So even though Daniel didn't want it, he made a promise in front of his 1,000 guests. So what does he do? He puts the purple on Daniel, puts the chain of gold around his neck, and he makes a proclamation that he is the number 3 guy in the whole kingdom, right? How wonderful. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So we know what night that was, because it was October 12th, 539, that the army that had defeated the Persian army that had defeated the Babylonian army, what they did, there's different stories about this. History's a hard thing. But this is what seems most compelling to me as I read the stories. You saw the walls, right? How are you going to defeat a city that big with walls like that? They rerouted the river. They dug and rerouted the river flowing into it so that it flowed a different way, and then they just marched right in on the dry riverbed and took the city without a battle. That's how they did. That's how they conquered it in one day. One day, that's how they conquered Babylon. And so Belshazzar is killed. Now let's see if I can go back to this for a minute. I have to put in the password again, I guess. Sorry, everybody. I'm not too good with technology.
Your monitor.
Oh, I'm off.
There we go. It's starting.
Okay. So,
Watch out for the cord.
I remember in college, because I had a liberal arts degree, so you have to take all these. So I had to take art appreciation. Did anyone else ever have to take art appreciation? So I am not presenting myself in any way, by any means, as an expert in art. I humbly bow to the ones who truly are experts. But I'm so glad I took that class, because up until that time, for me, art was just a bunch of pictures. Just like a bunch of pictures, and you like this picture, and you don't like that picture. That's all it is, until all of a sudden you start to understand why certain pieces of art are considered masters, and how you can look at them and start to see more in them. So this is a famous work of art called Belshazzar's Feast by Rembrandt. Anybody heard of him?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the 16th century, and let me just call attention to a few things here. There's the hand writing on the wall, and they make a big deal out of the fact that Rembrandt, the writing is not correct. Rembrandt knew Jewish people. He lived in Amsterdam, and he had Jewish friends and rabbis who taught him some of this stuff, but he didn't get it correct, or he was told the incorrect things. So they make a big deal out of that. But the bottom line is, I think for me, here's kind of the focus, right? It's a dark background. See how dark it is back there? But this is where the light is coming. The light is emanating from there as it hits the faces of the people. And here is Belshazzar, and they say that the work here by Rembrandt is really exquisite. The actual painting is about 7 feet across.
Oh, wow.
It's big. And if you get into this, I guess like the robe, the jewels, the turban, the woman's dress, there's intricate detail in there where he mixed the paint sometimes with chalk or things to give it different textures and stuff. It's very intricate, but the focus here in the center is Belshazzar himself. And look at how his head is spun around. See how it's like turned back like that?
All the way.
Yeah, and look at his eyes. They're almost popping out of his head. So it's just saying, it's reminding you of the picture of what we read there, that his color changed and his knees were knocking. He's throwing his arm up like this, almost as if like he's fending it off, like there's something there that's threatening to him. And you look at, in famous paintings, you sometimes look at lines. You don't notice them at first, but the more you stare at it. So you see there's an angle kind of coming up from this arm, pointing up in this direction. And then the alignment of the hands of the woman and his other hand, that same angle is pointing up this way. And then you have the table. Well, the table kind of got cut off. I don't have the whole thing up here, but there's a table down here and his arm here. So it's almost, there's like a quadrilateral, but it's pointing in this direction, taking your eyes up to see this horror. She's spilling the drink. He's spilling a drink over here. And then look at the other people. For one thing, they're painted all the way to the edge of the picture. Don't you think if you were painting something 7 feet tall, you'd put all the action in the middle and kind of put the background around there? But the people come right up to the edge of the picture. How many people were there? There were 1,000. But Rembrandt chose to picture this with just a very small number, and it's like they're pressed in there, and it gives the feel that it's like they're imprisoned in this, that they're trapped all of a sudden, realizing that everything's pressing in against them. Oh! There we go. And look at also where the people are looking. Now, Belshazzar is looking at the hand.
Yeah.
Where's she looking? She's looking at him. Where's this one looking? At him. This one, you can't see her face, but by the angle of her head, Where's she looking? At him. So it's almost like the focus of everything is upon him and the great terror that he's experiencing now, that he has been caught by God, and God's judgment and wrath is coming on him. So I think the law part of this chapter is that message that we saw with Nebuchadnezzar, that you can't get high and mighty with God. You can't think of yourself as so great and so powerful that you forget where you come from, and that he has done everything for you, and that his judgment against those who make themselves his enemies, who offend him, is very real. And he's gonna die that night, and he's gonna lose the whole kingdom. So that's the judgment, the part of it, the law. But there's also a gospel message in this chapter too. So look again at the very last verse of the chapter. So Belshazzar is killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The only place where Daniel mentions how old somebody is. Now, where's the gospel in that? Well, who is this Darius the Mede? There is going to be a Darius the Great who rules Persia many years later. The time frame doesn't fit. It can't be him. So some people, there's all kinds of theories out there. Some people think that maybe he's talking about not the king that's fighting, but the general who's fighting on behalf of the Persian king. Some people think that Darius is actually the throne name. So like Caesar, how many guys named Caesar were there in the Roman kings? There was one, Julius Caesar. But then they all became Caesar Tiberius, Caesar Augustus, right? So it becomes their throne name. So could Darius have been like the throne name? The king that actually conquers Babylon, we know, is a king called Cyrus the Great. And there's something written, again, in one of the historians. Did I write it down somewhere? Can't remember if it was Herodotus. Yeah, it is Herodotus. So Herodotus, a historian who lives a little more than 100 years after this happened, but he writes that Cyrus's father was a Persian, but his mother was a Mede. So here's Media up here. Here's Persia here. And that when he was born, his mother named him Darius, but when he became emperor later on, he took on the name Cyrus. So this Cyrus the Great is probably the one that's being referred to here as Darius the Mede. It also mentions that he's 62 years old. And we know when Cyrus died a few years later, he was 70, so that would have made him about 61 or 62 at the time that this happened. So this Darius the Mede is almost certainly Cyrus the Great. But why then would Daniel call him by this name, Darius, instead of calling him Cyrus? So take a look in your Bibles at Jeremiah chapter 51. Jeremiah 51.
Jeremiah what?
Jeremiah 51. Let's just start at verse 1. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will stir up the spirit of a destroyer against Babylon, against the inhabitants of Lebkamai, and I will send to Babylon winnowers, and they shall winnow her, and they shall empty her land when they shall come against her from every side on the day of trouble. I could read more there, but what's Jeremiah prophesying? This Babylon who conquered Judah and destroyed God's temple and took God's people into exile, God already had a plan that one day they would be destroyed. Now skip down to verse 11. Sharpen the arrows, take up the shields. The Lord has stirred up the spirit of the king of the Medes, because his purpose concerning Babylon is to destroy it, for that is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance for his temple. So he predicted already, nearly 70 years before this happened, that Babylon is going to be destroyed by the Medes. Now remember, Cyrus was half Median and half Persian. So when he grows up, he unites those two empires together. So by identifying him as the Mede, Daniel is letting us know that he's the one that fulfills this prophecy, that it would be the Medians that would destroy the Babylonians. And in fact, God not only knew it was going to be the Medians. Take a look at this, Isaiah 45. Look to Isaiah 45. There's multiple passages we could look up here. I'm just trying to pick one of each of these points I'm making for you, so you can stay with me. Isaiah 45, verse 1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. So here's a prophecy specifically about Cyrus, and guess what? Cyrus isn't even going to be born for 200 more years after this prophecy. God had this all planned. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He knew the guy's name before he was even born. He knew where the guy would come from, where his mother would come from. He had this all planned. And why was that? I mentioned it to you before in the vision of the giant statue, so that Babylon could fall. And then Media-Persia takes over. By the way, Media-Persia, after they took Lydia, and then they take Babylon, and they keep going. This little tiny map here, can you see the inset map?
Yeah.
All the orange is the kingdom of the Persian Empire at its fullest extent. The largest empire that ever existed up until that time, ever. But why did God allow that? So that the head could be taken over by the chest. The chest could be taken over by the torso. The torso could be taken over by the legs, Greece. The legs could be taken over by, I'm one behind myself, but Greece could be taken over by Rome. And so that in the time of Rome, what was God going to do? Establish a kingdom that would last forever. So all of this stuff that's happening, conquering a gigantic city like that in one day, all of that is happening because it's God's plan unfolding for the kingdom of Christ. So now we watch the news every day. I thought I'd be early, and now I'm a minute late. I'm sorry, but I will wrap up. So we've got Russia and Ukraine fighting every day, and now they're talking about Finland joining NATO. Now, why does NATO even exist? To protect mutual protection against Russia. And now the country adjoining Russia is going to be part of NATO. And the war is not going very good for Russia. And Putin's a little nutsy to begin with. You can put that on the tape, that's okay. Can you go to sleep every night and be 100% sure that that madman's not gonna? Yeah.
No.
You really can't. We live in perilous times. But we've got to remember that all of this stuff, whatever's unfolding in the world and the nations, God has it all in his hands. And it's all part of his master gigantic plan for the kingdom of Jesus Christ to be exalted one day. So we don't have to be afraid. All right, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed this.
Yeah.